Identity and access management, IAM, whether in the cloud or on premise, is similar to a soldier working in the army, but not just any army, the army of IAM, Identity and Access Management. And the army of IAM has a huge weaponry that can be used by its soldiers. A war chest of utilities, if you will. Now, this war chest is a precious resource and thus cannot just be given to any individual. Appropriate identity access management must first be enacted, even if we are playing guerrilla warfare and have found ourselves a guerrilla. You see, in order to give this guerrilla, aka the identity, the resources, aka the war chest, a strict army of IAM process must be followed, and this applies to people, processes, and procedures. And there are several components that form an IAM army, but let's start with the first one being identification, which involves provisioning a unique identity assertion. And an assertion serves as an identification, e.g., a user ID, which then allows a user, aka a subject, access to a system's resources by associating that user to the rights with a given identity. So, in this analogy, let's give the identity assertion, e.g., a user ID, to the gorilla, being Gorilla Kong 166. Oh yeah! It's also worth noting during this process, the user is usually given a password for authenticating the identity assertion. And it's worth noting that the entity issuing the password and identity assertion will retain a record of each use for use in recognizing the user later. For example, when the user logs into resources with that same user ID and password combo. And that username and password combo can be used for authentication to prove Gorilla Kong is a real gorilla. And once this identity is established, the next stage is for authorization. Now, in many cases, authorization means comparing the identity assertion against an access control list (ACL). So, Gorilla Kong would either have access to some of this weaponry through the identity assertion and the authorization that entails. For example, Gorilla Kong may be authorized for some weapons but not others. But in this analogy, let's assume Gorilla Kong is allowed these three weapons. So these are all ticks. So let's update our analogy. Here's Gorilla Kong again, but now he has these weapons, starting with the knife, then the gun, and then the bullets. Again, to recap, this is because Gorilla Kong 166, the identity assertion, has authorization to this ACL for these weapons. And to ensure compliance and enforcement of good practice of authentication and authorization, there is policy management, which serves as the enforcement arm of authentication and authorization and is established based on business needs and senior management decisions. And to quickly recap so far, it all starts with the identity assertion, which forms authentication and then authorization to the resource pool. And the upward arrow would be like this. And all these factors form access management, which allow the gorilla to do guerrilla warfare. Oh yeah! And this whole access process can be accessed by a federation or identity repository, which are basically third parties that exchange information as appropriate about users and their access to resources. In cases where IAM is spread out in different solutions and different platforms and different organizations, which also facilitates a key concept known as single sign-on, which we will talk about later in this video. Now, a very important technical keynote for both the CCSP and AWS Cloud Practitioner exams. When utilizing cloud environments for IAM, these rely heavily on a term known as secrets, which are basically keys and certificates, which may also be used in addition to the traditional username and passwords. However, there is a key difference in that secrets are managed through very fine-tuned cloud access controls. Now, moving the analogy on, imagine Gorilla Kong needs another weapon and he would have to go through this whole entire access management process in order to get such weapon. And suddenly this access management model can become very cumbersome for users, especially in the guerrilla warfare battlefield. And so this is where single sign-on SSO comes into play. Now, there are several ways to implement SSO, which you can find in my previous videos linked here, but generally, SSO refers to a situation where the user signs in once, usually to an authentication server, and then whenever the user, aka Gorilla Kong, wants to access a resource, e.g. a weapon, the weapon issuer actually checks the authentication server, which Gorilla Kong should have previously been authenticated to, and it all happens in the background, meaning Gorilla Kong doesn't need to do anything except for sign in once. And as long as Gorilla Kong stays signed in and authenticated to the authentication server, then Gorilla Kong can request as many weapons and resources as he wishes, as long as the gorilla is authenticated again to the authentication server. And now, another important concept for your CISSP, CCSP, and AWS Cloud Practitioner exams. There is a separate but interconnected component that links to SSO, which is known as an Identity Provider, IDP. Now, an IDP are services or systems that store and manage identities. Remember identities earlier in the video. And IDPs receive requests, say from the SSO service, and the SSO service may be an in-house IDP, e.g. on-prem, or it may be an external service, like those provided by Facebook or Google, etc. Either way, the IDP service receives authentication requests from the relevant SSO service, and the IDP validates those requests and the information provided. And if this all matches the identity and the user is authenticated, then the authorization is granted to the SSO service to let that user use those resources. And there is another service to be aware of known as Federated Identity Management, or Federation in general. And this is much the same as normal identity management, except it is used to manage identities across different organizations or different armies, if you will. You can think of it as single sign-on SSO that works across systems or services from multiple organizations, e.g. multiple army bases, and the identity again complements SSO, hence the arrow here, just like identity providers, but on a bigger scale. And again, this is a popular model in the cloud environments where many organizations use IDPs such as Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, or other identity providers to perform all of this for them. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point multi-factor authentication, which ties in again to the authentication and authorization process mentioned earlier in the diagram. But generally, MFA is having multiple factors when you log in rather than just your username and password, which is just one factor. But when tied together with something such as something you are, like a biometric scanner for your eyes or your fingerprint, and combined with Gorilla Kong's username and password, we can say this multi-factor is pretty secure to know Gorilla Kong is Gorilla Kong. And lastly, a few additional cloud concepts worth remembering for your exams. Firstly, secrets management. Secrets are like digital credentials, like keys, API tokens, password, and certificates, used to provide access to service and systems in the cloud, and for other purposes, where encryption or validation of identities are required. And secondly, the concept of zero trust or zero trust architecture, which is what it says on the tin. And I made a whole separate video linked now, which you can view on the whole concept of zero trust. But essentially, this moved away from the old adage of trust but verify, which no longer applies to today's modern threat landscape. And there you have it, ladies and gents. That is identity and access management explained in a nutshell, or should I say in guerrilla warfare terms. I hope you liked this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe to help support this channel so I can continue making great videos like this if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed the content as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you would like to see more content like this, it would be super fantastic if you could leave a like and subscribe to help support this channel's growth.